Marisol, a young Mexican bride chasing her dream of a new life in America, and Daniel, a wealthy Texan businessman admired for his success, looked like the perfect couple on their wedding day. But behind their smiles lay secrets, pride, and violence that would turn their marriage into a nightmare of control, betrayal, and survival. Marisol grew up in a dusty town in central Mexico, where narrow streets echoed with the sounds of children playing and vendors calling out their goods. Life was simple but harsh. Her father struggled with unstable work. Her mother stitched clothes for neighbors, and Marisol often dreamed of something bigger than the worn-down houses and endless fields. She wanted a life where she did not have to count every coin, where her younger siblings could study without worrying about school fees, and where she could finally feel free. That dream seemed unreachable until Daniel appeared. Daniel was introduced through distant relatives who praised him as a successful businessman in Texas. He was older, polished, and carried himself with confidence that immediately caught Marisol's attention. To her, he seemed like everything she had ever hoped for, a man who could give her security and the chance to live in America. When he showed interest, she felt both honored and anxious. Her family encouraged the match, believing this union would lift them all into a better future. Marisol, though nervous about leaving everything familiar, convinced herself it was destiny. She prepared for the wedding with a mix of joy and unease. Her friends celebrated. Her parents wept with pride, but deep inside her rested a secret she feared could ruin everything. She pushed the thought away, telling herself that Daniel's love would be stronger than the past. Crossing the border into Texas with her fiancé, she looked out of the bus window at the vast highways, thinking her new life was just beginning. The air smelled different, the streets were wider, and the possibilities seemed endless. Marisol believed her sacrifices and risks would finally bring her happiness. The wedding took place in a modest church in Houston, surrounded by flowers, music, and the smiling faces of family and friends. The day was bright and warm, the kind of weather that made everything feel hopeful. Marisol wore a simple white gown that shimmered under the soft lights, while Daniel stood tall in a dark suit, looking every part the proud groom. To outsiders, they appeared like the perfect couple starting a life full of promise. Guests clapped, laughed, and took photographs, capturing what seemed to be the happiest moment of their lives. For Marisol, the ceremony felt surreal. She walked down the aisle with her heart pounding, torn between excitement and fear. She told herself over and over that this was the start of her new chapter, that she must bury all doubts deep inside and embrace the path she had chosen. When she stood beside Daniel, she saw his eyes filled with affection and pride, and for a moment she believed everything would be fine. The vows were spoken, the rings exchanged, and the applause rang through the church as they kissed. After the ceremony, the celebration continued with music, dancing, and plates of food that filled every table. Marisol's family looked on with joy, grateful that their daughter had found a man who promised stability. Daniel appeared attentive, holding her hand, whispering promises of a bright future. Photographs captured her smile, but inside, Marisol still carried the secret she hoped would never surface. She wanted so badly to believe that her love and devotion would be enough to erase the past. As the night drew to a close, the young bride stepped into her new life, unaware of the storm that would soon unravel her dream. During their honeymoon, the warmth of celebration quickly faded. Daniel had planned a trip to a quiet resort, imagining it would be the perfect beginning to their marriage. At first, everything seemed ordinary: dinners by candlelight, strolls along the beach, and the kind of moments newlyweds are expected to cherish. But underneath the calm surface, tension grew. Daniel sensed something he could not put into words, a detail that unsettled him. Marisol, trying to enjoy the days, carried a nervous weight she could not shake. It was during one night, away from the glow of festivities, that Daniel made a discovery that shattered his expectations. He realized that Marisol was not a virgin, something he had assumed with certainty. To him, it was not simply a private matter, but a betrayal of trust, a crack in the image he had built of his new wife. His pride and sense of control felt wounded. In silence, resentment began to form, sharp and poisonous. He withdrew his warmth. His touches grew colder, and the affection that had marked their wedding vanished as though it had never existed. Marisol felt the shift instantly. Where there had once been gentle words, there was now only distance. She tried to reassure herself that he would forgive, that love would triumph. But Daniel's eyes no longer held tenderness. Instead, they carried an unspoken anger, heavy with judgment. The honeymoon ended not with joy, but with unease, a quiet storm gathering strength. Marisol returned to Texas with a growing fear she dared not voice, unaware that this discovery would mark the beginning of her nightmare. Daniel's silence was not a retreat, but the seed of vengeance, waiting to grow into something far more dangerous. Back in Texas, the fragile mask Daniel had worn during their courtship began to crack. The warmth and generosity that once defined him slipped away piece by piece, replaced with cold stares and sharp commands. At first, Marisol told herself it was stress from work, that the strain of new responsibilities explained his sudden changes. But soon it became clear that his disappointment in her had hardened into bitterness. The home that should have been a sanctuary turned into a place of tension, where every sound and silence carried the thread of anger. Daniel's control over Marisol tightened quickly. He questioned where she went, demanded to see her phone, and criticized the smallest details of her behavior. Trips outside were limited. Phone calls were cut short, and even her choice of clothes became points of contention. For Marisol, every day felt like walking on glass, unsure of what would set him off next. The promises of love whispered at their wedding now seemed like distant lies. Neighbors began to notice her withdrawal. Marisol, once full of life, now moved quietly, avoiding attention. She wore long sleeves even on warm days, her eyes lowered when people tried to greet her. Makeup covered marks that told a darker story, though she insisted nothing was wrong whenever someone showed concern. Inside, her heart carried both fear and shame. She worried about her family back home, about their pride in her marriage, and about what they would think if she admitted the truth. As Daniel grew colder, his control gave way to cruelty. The transformation was unmistakable. Marisol was no longer treated as a wife, but as someone who had failed him, and he made sure she felt it every single day. As the months passed, Daniel's anger no longer stayed hidden behind cold words or harsh stares. It erupted into violence that Marisol could neither predict nor escape. At first, the assaults were sudden slaps or pushes, moments of rage that left her shaken but silent. She hoped they were isolated, that if she behaved more carefully, he might calm down. But the violence only grew stronger, fueled by his bitterness and pride. Soon, what began with raised voices escalated into nights of terror. Marisol's body bore the marks of his hands, bruises on her arms, cuts she tried to hide, and aches that lingered long after the attacks. She learned to move slowly, to flinch before he even touched her, as though preparing for the next blow. The house, filled with elegant furniture and expensive decorations, became nothing more than a prison of fear. Every sound of his footsteps sent a chill through her chest. Every locked door reminded her of her isolation. Marisol never told her family back in Mexico the truth. She wrote cheerful letters and sent photographs with practiced smiles, keeping her secret buried. She did not want to shatter their pride or face their questions. To them, she appeared blessed with a new life in America, while in reality, she was trapped in a cycle of abuse that grew darker with each passing week. Daniel's rage followed no pattern. Sometimes it sparked from jealousy, other times from nothing at all. Alcohol made him crueler, his voice louder, his fists heavier. Each attack chipped away at Marisol's spirit until she felt more like a shadow than a person. She prayed quietly at night for strength, but the silence of the house swallowed her hope, leaving her alone with the weight of his violence. Daniel believed he was careful, but violence is never fully hidden. The walls of their suburban home could not mask the crashes of broken objects or the muffled cries that escaped Marisol's lips. Neighbors who once admired the young couple began to sense something was wrong. Mrs. Harper, who lived across the street, often saw Marisol walking stiffly, her steps slow and cautious. Others noticed the heavy makeup, the long sleeves on sweltering afternoons, and the way her eyes avoided contact as if she feared being truly seen. Rumors spread quietly in the neighborhood. Some whispered that Daniel was too controlling. Others suggested that Marisol was unhappy in her marriage. A few suspected abuse, but most chose silence, telling themselves it was not their place to interfere. In many households, the cries at night were dismissed as arguments that would eventually pass. Yet each person who turned away allowed the nightmare to continue unchecked. Marisol's isolation deepened. She had no close friends in Texas, no family nearby to lean on, and no confidence to reach out for help. Even when Mrs. Harper offered a ride to the store or asked gentle questions, Marisol forced a smile and declined. Fear of shame and deportation kept her chained, but so did the hope that somehow things would get better if she stayed quiet. Behind closed doors, Daniel's temper raged unchecked. The neighbors saw fragments of the truth, but none grasped the full horror unfolding within. Marisol's bruises faded and reappeared, her spirit shrinking each time. The warning signs glowed like fire, visible to anyone who cared to look. Yet the silence of those around her left her trapped, with each passing day pulling her closer to an inevitable breaking point. One stormy night, the tension inside the house reached its breaking point. Rain lashed against the windows while thunder rolled overhead, but the real storm was within the walls. A small argument that began over nothing quickly spiraled into something darker. Daniel, consumed by rage and resentment, struck Marisol with a force that sent her crashing to the floor. His fury did not stop there. The room became a battlefield of broken glass, overturned chairs, and desperate cries that went unheard beyond the walls. Marisol tried to shield herself, but her strength could not match his. Each blow left her weaker, her body crumpling under the weight of his violence. Hours seemed to stretch endlessly as the storm outside masked the chaos inside. By the time Daniel finally stopped, silence filled the house, broken only by the sound of the rain. Marisol lay motionless, her body battered, her breath faint. The next morning, the neighborhood stirred uneasily. Mrs. Harper, who had heard strange noises during the night, noticed the blinds drawn tightly and a broken lamp visible through the window. Concern grew until another neighbor, worried by the silence, called the police. When officers arrived, the sight that greeted them was harrowing. Blood smeared on the floor, shattered objects scattered across the room, and Marisol barely clinging to life. Paramedics rushed her to the hospital, her pulse weak but present. The officers arrested Daniel on the spot, his shirt stained, his expression cold. For those who saw the scene, it was unforgettable. The storm had passed outside, but inside that house, its devastation was permanent. What began as whispers of suspicion had erupted into a horror too brutal to ignore. At the hospital, doctors fought to pull Marisol back from the edge. Hours of surgery saved her life, but the damage could not be undone. Her body was covered in scars, her bones fractured, and her spirit deeply wounded. She would never again move with the ease she once had, and nightmares of that stormy night followed her even as she lay in recovery. Yet, despite her silence and suffering, she had survived. That survival alone became a quiet act of defiance against the man who had tried to break her completely. Daniel's arrest shocked the community. Neighbors who once ignored the signs now spoke of their suspicions, regretting the silence that had allowed the abuse to escalate. In court, prosecutors revealed his violent temper, his obsession with control, and the injuries Marisol had endured for months. The photographs of her bruises, the testimonies of medical staff, and the evidence of blood and broken furniture painted a grim picture that no one could deny. Daniel, once respected in his circle, now stood as a symbol of cruelty and pride twisted into violence. The trial ended with a lengthy prison sentence, but for Marisol, justice was complicated. She was free from him, yet not free from the memories. Reporters told her story, and activists pointed to her case as a reminder of how many victims suffer unseen. Some called her brave, others called her tragic, but Marisol herself remained quiet. She chose to live away from the spotlight, carrying her pain privately while trying to rebuild. Her dream of a perfect marriage had turned into a nightmare, but she was still alive to tell it. In her survival, she became an unspoken warning, a reminder of the darkness that can hide behind smiles and vows.